If one attempts to imagine China in the mid-19th century, one inevitably gets the feeling that an enormous, ancient civilization is standing on the very edge of an abyss. This is the point when the old world can no longer hold on, and the new world has not yet been born. And right at this moment, everything converged. Humiliation, poverty, despair, as if fate itself decided to test the nation's resilience. Imagine living in an empire that for centuries considered itself the center of the universe. The Celestial Empire, that is what the Chinese called their country, because they believed that nothing higher or more majestic simply existed. Emperors ruled by the will of heaven, officials conducted graceful ceremonies, and the common people, although they worked tirelessly, still felt part of something great. But then, in the 40s of the 19th century, everything collapsed. This began with the very first Opium War, which erupted in the year 1840. The British Empire, mistress of the seas and colonies, decided to forcibly open Chinese ports for its trade. And not just any kind of noble trade in tea or porcelain, no. The English transported opium into China, a poisonous drug that turned people into living corpses. By the mid-30s, more than 2 million kilograms of this poison were being imported into the country annually. 12 million Chinese became addicted. Every 30th resident of the empire was slowly dying, smoking opium in stuffy dens. Emperor Daoguang tried to stop this madness. He pleaded, coaxed, and even wrote letters to Queen Victoria herself, begging her to stop the immoral trade. It did not help. Then the Chinese authorities began to confiscate opium from British merchants and blockade their ships. And what happened? England declared war, officially, for insulting honest traders. In reality, for the right to continue poisoning an entire nation. The war lasted 3 years and ended in complete humiliation for China. The Qing Empire had almost 900,000 soldiers, while the English brought a little over 4,000. But what could poorly trained, hungry Chinese peasants in outdated armor do against modern cannons and rifles? Many officers and soldiers themselves smoked opium, so what kind of fighting capability could there be? China lost not just a war, it lost its faith in its own greatness. On the 29th of August, the year 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing was signed. China paid an enormous indemnity, 15 million taels of silver, ceded the island of Hong Kong to England, and opened 5 ports to Western trade. Foreign laws and foreign courts began operating in these cities. Chinese historiography still calls this time the beginning of the Century of Humiliations, a period when the great empire turned into a semi-colony. But the war and the humiliation were only the tip of the iceberg. A disaster far worse was brewing within the country. During the second half of the 18th century, China's population grew from 200 million to 400 million people. This was an incredible demographic explosion. Every patch of land was cultivated, every valley was settled, but there was still not enough land. By the beginning of the 19th century, there was less and less arable land per peasant. The price of rice, the foundation of life for the common Chinese person, rose 5 times in 50 years, from 6 or 7 to 30 or 40 qian per dan. Families starved. Infants were often killed at birth because it was impossible to feed them, especially girls. Their lives were considered less valuable. Furthermore, land was concentrated in the hands of wealthy landowners. Those who had money and connections bought up plots from ruined peasants. The common person turned into a tenant, giving half or even more of the harvest to the landlord. Taxes grew. The Qing Dynasty needed money for wars, for the upkeep of the court, and for bribes to officials. Corruption permeated the state apparatus from top to bottom. An official bought a position, then extorted triple the amount from the people to recoup his investment and still profit. In this atmosphere of general decay, those who were already on the margins of society suffered particularly. The Hakka. That is what one of the groups of Han Chinese who lived mainly in the south, in the provinces of Guangdong, Fujian, and Guangxi, were called. The word Hakka itself can be translated as guests or even sojourners. Their ancestors migrated from the north long ago, but over the centuries they never became accepted by the local population. They were considered outsiders, looked down upon, allocated the worst land in the mountains, and discriminated against when applying for civil service. The Hakka spoke their own dialect and maintained their own customs. Their women did not bind their feet, unlike the rest of the Chinese, and worked alongside men in the fields. This provoked contempt from the true Chinese. But the worst began when the Hakka started actively participating in popular movements against the Qing Dynasty. The Manchu rulers, who were themselves outsiders to the Han, suppressed any unrest among the Hakka, especially brutally. And so, in this explosive mixture of national humiliation, poverty, hunger, corruption, and social injustice, grew the feeling that the Qing Dynasty had lost what was called the mandate of heaven in China. According to ancient Chinese philosophy, the emperor does not simply rule by right of birth. Heaven chooses him, entrusts him with power. But if the ruler ceases to care for the people, if chaos and disaster reign in the country, then heaven has turned away from him. Therefore, the mandate is lost. In the evenings, peasants gathered in their villages and spoke about this in hushed tones. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, crop failures were perceived as signs from above. The defeat in the war with the overseas barbarians looked especially symbolic. If the emperor cannot protect the country, how can he be called the Son of Heaven? At night, small uprisings flared up in different corners of the vast empire. They were quickly suppressed, but the seeds of rebellion had already sprouted. In the heart of every peasant who bent his back in someone else's field, in the soul of every poor person who saw his children dying of hunger, despair ripened. But it was a special despair, not hopeless, but furious. The kind that pushes people not simply to submit, but to take up pitchforks and swords. All it needed was a spark for this fire to blaze across all of China. And this spark was just about to ignite in the south, in the poor mountain regions of Guangxi, where the Hakka lived, rejected, humiliated, but ready to fight. The empire stood on the brink. The people waited for a sign, and this sign would appear in the form of a man who would declare himself the messenger of heaven, the younger brother of Jesus Christ himself, a man who would lead millions and create an unprecedented state, the heavenly kingdom of great peace. Thus, the spark we spoke of found its embodiment in a man named Xiuquan. But to understand how a simple village teacher turned into a prophet who would lead millions to war, we need to return to the very beginning of his path, to where dreams are born and fates are broken. On the 1st of January, the year 1814, a boy was born in the small village of Fuyuan Village, 30 miles north of Guangzhou, to a poor peasant family of the Hakka people. They named him Hong Huaqiu, Brilliant Fire. He was the younger third son in a family that already had 2 elder brothers and 2 sisters. His father, Hong Jingyang, was a simple peasant, but he was chosen as the village headman, meaning he was respected by his fellow villagers. His mother's surname was Wang. They lived modestly, working in the fields from dawn till dusk, like everyone else around them. But Huaqiu was a special child. Even at 5 years old, he showed a lively mind and a craving for knowledge. At 5 years old, he was sent to the village school, where he was taught by a not very successful scholar named Ding Jin, a man who himself had failed the state exams. But for a poor Hakka village family, even such a teacher was a luxury. The boy grasped everything quickly. It is said that by 10 or 11 years old, he already knew the 4 books by heart, the foundation of Confucian education. And then the family made a decision that would change not only the boy's life, but the fate of all China. they decided to invest all their effort and resources in his education. You see, in the China of that time, there was only one way up for a poor person: to pass the imperial exams and enter the civil service. This was a chance to escape poverty, bring glory and money to the family and the village. The entire village chipped in to pay for the capable young man's tuition. Can you imagine the responsibility? The hopes of not only his parents but all his fellow villagers rested on his shoulders. At 15 or 16 years old, he adopted his literary name, Xiuquan, which means elegant and perfected. A beautiful name for a man with great ambitions. He was intelligent, diligent, and believed in himself. But here was the problem. The imperial examination system was cruel. Only a few passed out of hundreds of thousands of candidates, less than 1%. And it was not just about knowledge. Money was needed for travel, for living expenses in the provincial capital, and for bribes to officials. In the year 1827, when Xiuquan was only 13 years old, he attempted to pass the lowest level of exams for the first time, and he failed. Not surprising, he was too young, too poor, too inexperienced. But he did not give up. He started working as a teacher in a village school, saving money, and preparing again. In the year 1836, when he was 22 years old, he traveled to Guangzhou, the main city of the province and the center of trade with the West. It was a noisy, huge city, unfamiliar to a village boy. Everything was different here. Wide streets, wealthy merchants, foreigners in strange clothes. And in this city, the first encounter occurred that would turn his life upside down, though he did not realize it yet. On the street, he saw a foreign missionary, an American named Edwin Stevens, and his Chinese assistant, Liang Fa, who were handing out brochures and preaching. Xiuquan, out of curiosity, took several pamphlets. They were called Good Words to Exhort the Age. Liang Fa, himself a converted Christian, compiled them from excerpts of the Bible and his own interpretations. Hong glanced at them and put them aside. He was busy, the exams were near, and again he failed. A year later, in the year 1837, he came to Guangzhou for the third time. By this point he was 23 years old, and the pressure on him was enormous. His family was in debt, the village was waiting, the years were slipping away. And again, failure. The third in a row. This was too much. Xiuquan returned home broken. It is said he was carried on a stretcher. He was so weak. At home, his condition worsened. A severe fever began. He was delirious, tossing and losing consciousness. His family feared he would die. He spent 40 days between life and death. And during these days, in his feverish delirium, visions appeared to him. He would later recount that he ascended to heaven. There he was met by a majestic elder in black dragon robes, wearing a high cap with a long golden beard. The elder was so ancient and powerful that it seemed he had existed forever. He told Xiuquan that people had forgotten him and were worshipping demons instead of the true God. The elder handed him a sword and a golden seal, weapons for exterminating these demons. Then another man appeared, middle-aged, majestic, and kind. He introduced himself as the elder son of that same ancient ruler and began teaching Xiuquan how to fight the demons, how to use the sword. Together, they killed evil spirits, cleansing heaven. In some versions of the visions, Xiuquan recounted seeing Confucius, the great sage who had been revered in China for centuries, being punished by the Heavenly Father for leading people astray from the true path. When Xiuquan finally woke up, he was a different man. His relatives said that he had become more cautious, friendly, and open. His gait became firm, and he seemed to have grown and strengthened. But most importantly, he now knew that he was special, that he had a divine destiny. However, he did not yet understand exactly what these visions meant. For the next few years, Xiuquan worked as a teacher in various schools near his native village. He lived modestly, quietly, but something had changed inside. He stopped preparing for the exams with his former fervor. It was as if he understood that his path lay elsewhere. And so, in the year 1843, he went for the exams for the fourth and final time. He was already 29 years old, by Chinese standards, almost old for a candidate. And again, failure. The fourth, final. The door to the world of officials and wealth slammed shut forever. But it was at this moment that enlightenment occurred. His cousin visited him, and during the conversation, those Christian brochures Xiuquan had received 7 years earlier in Guangzhou were accidentally mentioned. He retrieved them, dusted them off, and began to read, carefully, thoughtfully, unhurriedly. And suddenly, everything clicked. The elder with the golden beard, that was God the Father, whom the Chinese had long called Shangdi, the supreme deity. The middle-aged man, that was Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And therefore he, Xiuquan, was also a son of God, the younger brother of Jesus. He was given a mission to cleanse the world of demon worship. And by demons, he understood not abstract evil, but very specific idols, Buddhist and Taoist gods, Confucian temples, and most importantly, the Manchu Qing Dynasty, which had enslaved the Han people. Imagine what was going on in his soul. Years of humiliation, failures, broken hopes, and suddenly, it turned out that all of this was part of a divine plan. He was not a failure, not the laughingstock of the village. He was the chosen one, the messenger of heaven, the brother of Christ himself. Xiuquan believed this with all his heart. Unlike many other leaders who would appear later in his movement, he sincerely, deep down, believed in his divine mission. For him, this was not a political game or a trick. It was the truth. He began to act. The first thing he tackled was the idols. He went and destroyed all the statues in the local temples and burned the Confucian tablets. His fellow villagers were in shock. Then he ordered 2 enormous swords, a meter in length each, weighing 4.5 kilograms. He called them the demon-slaying swords, a symbolic gesture to cleanse China of Confucianism and all old beliefs. But destroying idols was not enough. He needed to create something new. And Xiuquan, along with his cousin Feng Yunshan, began to preach. His religion was a surprising mix. The foundation was Christianity, but filtered through the prism of the Chinese worldview. He merged the Christian God with the ancient Chinese Shangdi. He added elements of Taoism, folk beliefs, and Confucian ethics. The result was something completely new, a syncretic religion, understandable to simple Chinese peasants, yet revolutionary. They created the society of worshippers of the heavenly ruler. They preached the equality of all people before God, condemned the smoking of opium, the consumption of alcohol, and adultery. They said that heaven loves everyone equally, the rich and the poor, the Han and the Hakka. For the tormented, downtrodden peasants, especially the despised Hakka, this sounded like music. Finally, someone told them that they were not rubbish, not the dregs of society, but the beloved children of God. Xiuquan and Feng Yunshan began traveling through the villages of Guangxi, the poorest province, where thousands of similarly despairing people lived. They preached in squares, baptized willing participants, and created communities. The number of followers grew, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. The poor, the dispossessed, those who had nothing to lose, flocked to him. They saw in Xiuquan not just a preacher, they saw a savior, one who would lead them out of the darkness. By the end of the 40s of the 19th century, the Society of Worshippers of the Heavenly Ruler already numbered tens of thousands of members. It transformed from a religious sect into a powerful social movement. The Qing Dynasty authorities began to get nervous. Too many people were gathering around this strange preacher who called himself the brother of Jesus. Too much talk about equality and justice. Too open a critique of the existing order. And Xiuquan continued to preach. His eyes burned with faith. He knew for sure, that the time to act would soon come, that his army of believers would turn into an army of warriors, that he would create the heavenly kingdom right here on earth, and that no force could stop the will of heaven. The spark had ignited. All that remained was to wait for the wind that would fan it into a flame, and that wind was already rising over the hills of Guangxi. You know what is most amazing about the history of the Taiping Rebellion? How quickly a group of believing peasants transformed into a formidable military force, literally in just a couple of years, from a few dozen people praying in a village chapel to tens of thousands of warriors capable of crushing imperial armies. This does not happen by itself. Behind it lies organization, discipline, and of course, the despair of people who had nothing to lose. By the end of the 40s of the 19th century, the society of worshippers of the heavenly ruler had grown so large that the authorities ceased to take it as a joke. In Guangxi province, the poorest and most turbulent in the empire, more and more people gathered. First hundreds, then thousands. By the beginning of the 50th year, there were already about 40,000 people. 40,000! This was not a religious community. It was already an army. And it was not just about the number. These people were different. They did not just listen to sermons on Sundays and go home. They lived by new rules. Feng Yunshan, the same cousin of Xiuquan who helped create the movement, turned out to be not only a preacher, but also a brilliant organizer. While Xiuquan traveled and studied the Bible with missionaries, Feng built a structure, a military structure. Imagine, every member of the society knew his place. 5 people constituted a squad under the command of a corporal, 2 squads, a platoon with a sergeant, 4 platoons, a company of 100 or so people, 5 companies, a brigade of 500 or so fighters, and 5 brigades, a division under the command of a colonel, and 5 divisions, an entire army of over 13,000 warriors under the command of a general. This was a copy of the ancient military system of the Qing Dynasty, the one that existed more than 2,000 years ago. Xiuquan and his associates knew that continuity and connection with the great past were important to the Chinese peasant. They were not just creating a gang of rebels, they were reviving the army of ancient heroes. But most importantly, discipline. Iron, ruthless discipline. There was no theft, no drunkenness, no disorder. Violations of the rules resulted in corporal punishment, public humiliation, and loss of rank. Men and women lived separately. Even husband and wife were forbidden to sleep in the same room. This was Xiuquan's demand, based on his ideas of purity. To a modern person, this seems absurd, but then, in the mid-19th century, such a strict moral code made an impression. People saw, these believers are not just rebels, they are building a new world according to new laws. By the beginning of the summer of the year 1850th, the tension in Guangxi reached its limit. The local Qing Dynasty authorities finally decided to act. Arrests and persecutions of society members began. Officials understood, if they did not crush this movement now, it would be too late later. Believers were captured, tortured, and executed. But this only added fuel to the fire. In July, the first real clash occurred. A small battle, but symbolically important. The sectarians repelled the government troops. And then it became clear there was no turning back. Either victory or death. There would be no compromise. Xiuquan and his leaders, Feng Yunshan, Yang Xiuqing, Xiao Chaogui, Wei Changhui, Shi Dakai, gathered for a council. These men would become the kings of the future heavenly kingdom, but for now, they were simply trying to survive. The decision was harsh and uncompromising. Burn everything that connected them to the past and retreat into the mountains. Not to retreat, but to leave in order to organize, gain strength, and return as an army, not a mob of refugees. In December of the year 1850th, what would later be called the Taiping Rebellion began. Thousands of people, men, women, children, the elderly, burned their homes. Yes, they burned them. They left nothing to which they could return. This was an act of complete renunciation of the old world. Smoke rose over the villages of Guangxi, and people with bundles and weapons in hand left for Thistle Mountain, where the rebels' headquarters were located. Colliers, farmers, landless laborers, and ruined artisans joined them, all those who had nothing to lose. By the end of December, about 50,000 people had gathered at the mountain. On the 25th of December, the battle took place near Jintian village, the very place where the society's headquarters was located. Qing troops tried to crush the rebels' camp, but they held their ground. More than that, they counterattacked. The 10,000-strong rebel army, commanded by Feng Yunshan and Wei Changhui, defeated the government forces. Qing soldiers, poorly trained and demoralized, did not expect such resistance. They were accustomed to dispersing hungry peasants. But here stood a real army before them, organized, fanatical, ready to die for their heavenly king. And so, on the 11th of January, the year 1851, on Hong Xiuquan's 37th birthday, the heavenly kingdom of great peace, Taiping Tianguo, was solemnly proclaimed. Hong Xiuquan took the title of Tianwang, heavenly king. He was no longer just a preacher. He became a ruler, a monarch, God's representative on earth. His closest associates received the titles of Wang, kings. Young Shu King, a peasant and former collier, became the East King and de facto military commander. Xiao Chaogui, the West King. Feng Yunshan, the South King. Wei Changhui, the North King. Shida Kai, the Wing King. This was not just a religious sect, it was a state, with its own capital, albeit temporary, with its own army, with its own laws, with its own faith, and with a completely insane goal, from the Qing Dynasty's point of view, to overthrow the Manchu rulers and create the heavenly kingdom throughout all of China. The first months were the hardest. Qing troops surrounded the Taipings, trying to crush the rebellion in its infancy. But the Taipings did not just hold their ground, they attacked. In February or March of the year 1851, they repelled several attacks by government forces. The Qing army, which on paper numbered almost 1 million soldiers, proved in reality to be a colossus with feet of clay. Officers stole pay, soldiers deserted, many themselves smoked opium, and the command was chaotic. And the Taipings? They had religious fanaticism. They went into battle singing, believing that their heavenly Father would protect them. They fought not for money, but for an idea, for the dream of a just world where there are no rich and poor, where all are equal before God. Of course, many died, but new people came to replace the fallen, peasants from villages who saw the Taipings as liberators. In September of the year 1851, the Taipings began their great march north. They left Guangxi and moved along the Xiang River into Hunan province. Their army grew daily. Entire cities and villages joined the rebellion. By the end of the year, there were already more than 120,000 people. 120,000 in 1 year, from 50,000 to 120,000. This was an avalanche that could no longer be stopped. The Qing Dynasty began to understand. This was not a local riot that could be suppressed in a couple of weeks. This was a war, a civil war that would split China in two and claim millions of lives. But the imperial officials in Beijing would learn about this later. For now, in the beginning of the 51st year, an army was being born in the mountains of Guangxi that would soon control territory with a population of 30 million people. An army that would reach the walls of Nanjing and make the ancient capital the center of the heavenly kingdom. The spark turned into a fire, and this fire was just beginning to blaze. In the spring of the year 1852, the Taiping army moved north, and this was not just a military campaign, it was an avalanche that swept away everything in its path. Every city they passed through became either their ally or ashes. There were no compromises. The old world burned behind them, and a new one opened before them. the one they intended to build with their own hands. The first major target was the city of Yong'an in the north of Guangxi province. It was an important administrative center, well fortified, with a large garrison. For the Taipings, capturing it meant showing all of China. They were no longer a fragmented group of refugees, but a real force capable of assaulting fortresses. On the 27th of August, the year 1851, after a stubborn battle, the Taipings broke into Yong'an. Qing troops fled in panic, abandoning their weapons and banners. The city fell. And here, in the captured Yong'an, something important happened. Xiuquan and his associates realized, to govern the growing territory, they needed not just an army, they needed a real state machine. They began to form a government. The 5 closest companions of Xiuquan officially received the titles of Wang, kings. Yang Shuking became the East King, Xiao Chaogui, the West King, Feng Yunshan, the South King, Wei Changhui, the North King, and the young and talented Shi Dakai, the Wing King. Each of them was responsible for his own sphere: military operations, supply, civil administration, ideology. This was no longer a rebel free-for-all, but a strict hierarchy, almost imperial in its structure. In Yong'an, the Taipings established the first military workshops. You see, capturing a city was only half the battle. They needed to arm the thousands of new recruits who joined the rebellion every day. Blacksmiths forged swords and spears, carpenters made shields and siege ladders, armorers repaired captured rifles and cannons. The organization was astonishing. Every fighter knew his place in the ranks. A fivesome of 5 people, the smallest unit. 5 fivesomes, a platoon. 4 platoons, a company. 5 companies, a regiment. Regiments were combined into corps numbering several thousand fighters. This was an ancient military system dating back to the time of the Qing Dynasty, which existed more than 2,000 years ago. But the Taipings breathed new life into it. Discipline was ironclad. No looting of the local population. This was strictly punished. Provisions were taken from government warehouses or requisitioned from the rich, but the common peasant's grain was not touched. On the contrary, they were distributed land, debt notes were burned, and justice was promised. Before entering a new city, the Taiping sent agitators ahead. They talked about the goals of the rebellion, that they came to overthrow the alien Manchu dynasty, exterminate the wealthy and corrupt officials, and build a society of equality. For the tormented peasants, this sounded like a fairy tale, and many believed. Entire villages joined the Taiping army. By the end of the year 1851, the army had grown to 120,000 people. 120,000! This was a formidable force. They moved north along the Xiang River, capturing city after city. Guilin, Changsha, ancient centers of Chinese civilization, one by one bowed before the Taiping onslaught. However, not all cities were easily taken. They besieged Changsha, the capital of Hunan province, for almost 3 months and failed to capture it. But this did not stop them. They bypassed the city and moved on, toward the great Yangtze River, the main waterway of China. The Yangtze was a frontier. Beyond it lay the empire's wealthiest region, fertile valleys, major trading cities, and huge food reserves. Whoever controlled the Yangtze controlled the heart of China. And at the end of the year 1852 and the beginning of the 53rd year, the Taipings crossed the river, in winter, over the ice and in boats, under fire from Qing troops. Losses were heavy, but they broke through. Ahead lay Nanjing, the ancient capital, a city with 1,000 years of history, a place where emperors of the great Han Ming dynasty once ruled, which the Manchus overthrew in the mid-17th century. For the Han people, and most Taipings were Han, Nanjing had enormous symbolic significance. It was the capital of their ancestors, the last stronghold of Chinese, not foreign, power. Taking Nanjing meant not just seizing a city, it meant declaring to the world, we are restoring what was lost 200 years ago. We are returning China to the Chinese. On the 19th of March, the year 1853, the siege of Nanjing began. The city was well fortified, massive walls 20 meters high, a deep moat, and a large Manchu garrison. But the Taipings were determined. They dug tunnels under the walls, used gunpowder for explosions, and built siege towers. The assault lasted 10 days. 10 days of continuous fighting as waves of attackers crashed against the walls again and again. On the 19th of March, the Taipings finally broke through. The city fell. The Manchu garrison, about 40,000 soldiers along with their families, was almost completely annihilated. Some fought to the last, some committed suicide, unwilling to surrender. The massacre was terrible. The Taipings showed no mercy to the Manchus. To them, they were invaders, usurpers, enemies by blood. But the Chinese population of the city was spared. Moreover, it was announced that Nanjing would now become the capital of the new state, the heavenly capital, Tianjin, of the heavenly kingdom of great peace. Imagine the atmosphere of those days. A city, for centuries under Manchu rule, suddenly liberated. Yellow Taiping banners with the hieroglyphs, heavenly kingdom, flying on the gates. Preachers on the streets talking about a new life where all are equal before God. The palaces of Manchu officials are being turned into barracks and warehouses. And in the center of the city, construction begins on the residence for Xiuquan, the heavenly king, the anointed of God. By the spring of the 53rd year, the Taipings controlled a vast territory, from Guangxi and Hunan provinces in the south to the Yangtze in the north. The population of these lands was about 30 million people. 30 million. This was an empire within an empire. Reforms began to be implemented in the controlled lands. Land was taken from the landlords and redistributed among the peasants. All old debts and taxes were abolished. New, more just, as the Taipings believed, orders were introduced. Women were allowed to take exams for official posts, an unheard of thing in traditional China. But the Taiping leaders understood, as long as Beijing stood, as long as the Qing Dynasty emperor lived, the war was not over. And in May of the year 1853, having barely secured themselves in Nanjing, they made a decision to send an army north directly to the imperial capital. This was a bold, almost insane decision. 2 armies, about 30,000 fighters, under the command of young generals Lin Fengxiang and Li Kaifang, moved through Anhui, Henan, and Shanxi provinces toward Beijing. They moved quickly, bypassing major cities, trying not to get involved in long sieges. The goal was one, the capital. By the end of the autumn of the 53rd year, they reached the Tianjin area, only 100 kilometers from Beijing. Panic began in the capital. Wealthy Manchus packed their belongings and fled to Manchuria. Emperor Xianfeng even moved his treasures out of the city, fearing the worst. But here, luck turned away from the Taipings. You see, northern China was completely different. The peasants there did not live as badly as in the south. They were not eager to join some southerners with an incomprehensible dialect and a strange religion. The local Nian rebels, whose support the Taipings were counting on, also did not rush to help. And most importantly, the Qing Dynasty mobilized all its forces. Mongolian cavalry arrived from Mongolia, thousands of riders, hardened in battle, perfectly adapted to the cold northern winters. The Taipings were trapped. They settled in the small town of Jinghai, south of Tianjin, awaiting reinforcements. But the reinforcements did not come. They were intercepted by Qing troops. A siege began. The southerners, accustomed to a warm climate, suffered from the severe frosts. There was no food. Communication with Nanjing was cut off. They were completely alone, 1,000 kilometers from home, surrounded by enemies. In February of the year 1854, the Taipings attempted to break through to the south. A painful retreat began along the snowy roads. The Mongolian cavalry pursued them, giving no respite. General Lin Fengxiang was captured, taken to Beijing, and executed. Li Kaifeng, with the remnants of the troops, tried to break back, but the odds were unequal. By the spring of the 55th year, the northern expedition ended in disaster. Almost all the fighters died. No one asked for mercy. Everyone fought to the end. This was the first serious blow to the Taipings. They lost 30,000 of their best warriors, missed the chance to take Beijing when it was so close. But most importantly, they showed the Qing Dynasty that they were not invincible, that they could be stopped if forces were gathered and the right actions were taken. And in Nanjing, Xiuquan drifted further and further from reality. He locked himself in his palace, surrounded himself with concubines, and stopped appearing before the people. The governance of the state passed to his associate kings, among whom contradictions and intrigues were already beginning to ripen. The triumphal march had ended. A long, bloody war of attrition was beginning. You know what is most striking about the history of the Taiping Kingdom? Not the military victories, not the captured cities, not even Xiuquan himself with his visions. The most amazing thing is that they truly tried to build a new world, not just to overthrow the old power, but to create a society that the history of China had never seen, a utopia on earth, the kingdom of God here and now. Imagine, it is the spring of the 53rd year, Nanjing has just been taken, the dust of battle has not yet settled, and the Taipings are already issuing decrees about new orders. This was not a typical change of power, where one emperor replaces another, and the system remains the same. No, the Taipings took aim at the very foundation of Chinese society, at what seemed eternal and unshakable, like the mountains themselves. At the center of everything was the idea of theocracy, power given by God. Xiuquan was not just an emperor. He was the heavenly king, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the representative of the Heavenly Father on earth. Every law, every reform came not from people, but supposedly from God himself. This gave everything a special force and unquestionability. One could not argue with the will of heaven. The first and main blow was the land reform. In old China, land was concentrated in the hands of wealthy landlords. A peasant could bend his back his whole life in someone else's field, give half the harvest to the owner, and still not feed his family. The Taipings, however, declared, all land belongs to the Heavenly Father, and therefore must be divided equally among all his children. The system was called the Heavenly Treasury. The essence was simple and revolutionary at the same time. Land was divided into 9 categories depending on fertility. Every person older than 16 years, both man and woman, mind you, received an equal plot. Children up to 15 years old received half as much. It did not matter who you were, a former landlord or a laborer, rich or poor. Everyone is equal before God, so the land must be divided justly. Everything a family grew beyond what was needed for sustenance had to be handed over to the communal granary. There, the products were stored and distributed among those who lacked them. The elderly, the sick, the orphans, all received their share from the communal treasury. On paper, this looked like the ideal Christian society of the first apostles, where everything was common property and no one was in need. In practice, however, implementing this proved much more difficult, but more on that later. But what truly shocked contemporaries was the attitude toward women. You see, in traditional China of the 19th century, a woman was almost property. First, of her father, then of her husband, then of her son. Her feet were bound in childhood. Bones were broken so the foot would remain small, like an infant's. This was considered beautiful, but it made the woman practically disabled, unable to walk normally. Women could not take state exams, could not own property, and could not make decisions. Their world was limited to the inner chambers of the house. And then the Taipings came and declared, "Before God, men and women are equal. Therefore, they must be equal on earth as well." The first thing they did was ban foot binding, a cruel practice that crippled millions of girls. Women were allowed to study, read sacred texts, and take exams for official posts. Moreover, they created women's military units, women soldiers, women officers, even women generals. For traditional Chinese society, this was unthinkable, almost sacrilegious. However, it must be said honestly, the equality was not complete. Women officers only commanded women's units, not men. Real power in the government remained in the hands of men. All the kings, all the highest positions, were occupied exclusively by men. But even such limited equality was a gigantic step forward. Many historians consider the Taiping Rebellion the beginning of feminism in China. The Taipings banned everything they considered sinful and corrupting. Opium, the poison that the English forcibly imported into China, was strictly prohibited under penalty of death. Alcohol was also banned. Tobacco, too. In his version of the Bible, Xiuquan even rewrote episodes where wine was mentioned. In his version, the righteous drank water or tea, not wine. Prostitution was punished by death. Gambling, death. Slavery was completely abolished. But the strangest restrictions were related to gender relations. The Taipings introduced a strict separation of men and women. They lived in different barracks in different parts of the city. Meeting without supervision was forbidden. And what is most surprising, even spouses were forbidden to live together. Husband and wife had to live separately and meet only rarely. Where did this strangeness come from? The fact is that Xiuquan rewrote the seventh commandment. In the Standard Bible it says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," and Hong added, "Thou shalt not commit adultery and thou shalt not be licentious." And he interpreted this as strictly as possible. Even ordinary conjugal relations he considered something sinful that distracts from serving God. In his version of the Bible it was written, "A man or woman who commits adultery or is licentious is considered a monster." This is the greatest violation of the heavenly commandments. Parents could not hug their children of the opposite sex. Brothers and sisters had to keep their distance. This was so rigid that it caused outrage even among loyal Taipings. However, these rules softened over time. Life took its course. But in the first years, the discipline was ironclad. The Taipings declared war on all traditional Chinese religions. For them, Confucius, Buddha, Taoist immortals, all of this was demons, turning people away from the true God. Everywhere the Taiping armies passed, temples burned. Buddhist monasteries with their libraries of ancient manuscripts turned to ashes. Confucian shrines were razed to the ground. Ancestral tablets, the most sacred thing in Chinese culture, were thrown out and broken. In Nanjing, this ancient center of Chinese culture, the Taipings destroyed almost all Confucian and Buddhist monuments. Statues of gods were smashed with religious fervor. Works of Confucius were burned at the stake, and those who tried to sell them were executed. Foreign missionaries, Christians who came to China, were initially glad. Finally, someone was fighting paganism. But then they were horrified by the scale of the destruction. This was not conversion to Christianity, but cultural genocide. Interestingly, Xiuquan himself did not reject all Confucian heritage. He said that Confucius once carried the truth, but then his teaching was distorted, turned into a tool of oppression. Therefore, it was necessary to destroy not the philosophy itself, but its distorted form. Over time, especially in the 60s, when the Taipings needed the support of educated Chinese, the attitude softened. They even began to restore Confucian temples and hold exams based on classical books. But the initial blow was struck, and the cultural losses turned out to be enormous. The basis of the new faith became the authorized Taiping version of the Bible. Xiuquan began working on it back in the year 1847, long before the rebellion. He took the Chinese translation of the Bible, done by the missionary Gutzlaff, and reworked it according to his own theology. In some places he corrected errors and inaccuracies, in others he improved the style. But the main thing was that he adapted the text to Chinese realities and his own ideas. Hong presented the Bible as the restoration of the ancient religion of China. He believed that once, thousands of years ago, the Chinese worshipped the true God, Shangdi, the supreme emperor. But then Confucius and the imperial system came, and everything was distorted. Now he, Hong Xiuquan, was returning the authentic faith of their ancestors to the people. In his version of the Bible, God was a strict but just ruler, punishing wicked nations and rewarding the righteous. This was understandable to the Chinese peasant, raised on the concepts of the mandate of heaven. The Taipings also carried out a calendar reform. The old lunar Chinese calendar was abolished. It was too tied to traditional astrology and imperial power. A solar calendar was introduced, where the year was divided not according to lunar cycles, but according to the movement of the sun. This was practical. The solar year corresponds more accurately to the agricultural cycle. But most importantly, it was a break with the past, with the traditions of the Qing Dynasty. Literature also underwent reform. The classical Chinese language, used by scholar officials, was complex and incomprehensible to the common people. The Taiping simplified the language, making it more accessible. They published brochures and proclamations in simple vernacular language so that every peasant could understand. This was another manifestation of their idea of equality. Knowledge should not be the privilege of the educated elite. But there was one big problem with all these beautiful reforms. They worked poorly in practice. The land reform was never fully implemented. The war required all efforts and resources. The communal treasury existed more on paper than in reality. The equality of women ran up against millennia of tradition and resistance even within the movement. The bans on spouses meeting caused such dissatisfaction that they had to be softened. And most importantly, Hong Xiuquan himself and his associate kings did not live by the same rules they imposed on the people. Hong Xiuquan locked himself in a luxurious palace, surrounded himself with dozens of concubines, even though he forbade common people from even seeing their wives. The kings built themselves palaces and accumulated wealth while preaching the renunciation of property. This contradiction between utopian ideology and actual practice would internally corrode the Taiping kingdom. But one cannot deny, they tried. They tried to create a society where the poor are equal to the rich, where women are equal to men, where the land belongs to the one who cultivates it, where opium does not poison the people, and knowledge is accessible to all. Many of these ideas were decades ahead of their time, and even if the utopia did not happen, even if the heavenly kingdom was drowned in blood and contradictions, the attempt itself was grandiose. It showed that one can dream of a different world, and that sometimes these dreams are capable of raising millions of people to fight. You know what ruins revolutions most often? Not external enemies, not a lack of resources, not military defeats. They are killed by what happens internally, when comrades who marched shoulder to shoulder through fire and water suddenly turn into rivals, when ideals shatter against the reality of power, when it turns out that building a new world is much more difficult than destroying the old one. After the capture of Nanjing in the 53rd year, a strange metamorphosis occurred with Hong Xiuquan. The man who once walked on foot through villages, preaching equality, who slept on the bare ground with common fighters, suddenly seemed to be reborn. He settled in a luxurious palace, the former residence of the Manchu governors, and hardly ever left it again. Imagine a huge complex of buildings with red walls, gilded roofs, gardens, and pavilions, hundreds of servants, dozens of concubines. It is said there were more than 80, and according to some sources, even 100, even though he forbade ordinary Taipings from seeing their lawful wives. Xiuquan plunged into a world of palace ceremonies and religious rituals. He wrote decrees, composed hymns and prayers, but barely engaged in the real governance of the state. Power passed to the one who truly held the strings of control, Yang Shuqing, the East King. This man deserves a separate story. He was born into a poor family of colliers, worked in the fields and forests as a child, and received almost no education. But he possessed natural intelligence, iron will, and incredible charisma. When the rebellion began, he was one of the first to join Xiuquan. He quickly rose through the ranks of the hierarchy, from a simple fighter to the commander of the troops. It was Yang Shuqing who stormed Nanjing. His troops formed the core of the capital's garrison, the best, battle-hardened soldiers. He was the de facto ruler of the Heavenly Kingdom. He organized the army supply system, established weapons production, and created an extensive network of spies and informants. Thanks to him, the Taipings were able to hold the captured territories and repel the first counterattacks of the Qing Dynasty. But Yang Shuqing was a man of power and ambition. He was not satisfied with the role of second in command. Moreover, he began to use religion to consolidate his power. From time to time, he would fall into a trance and declare that the Heavenly Father himself, God, was speaking through him. And in these revelations, he criticized Xiuquan himself for various transgressions. Can you imagine the situation? Hong considered himself the Son of God, the brother of Christ. And here, his subordinate declares that God the Father is dissatisfied with the Son and transmits his reproaches through him, Yang Shuqing. This was humiliating and dangerous. Some historians write that Yang Shuqing was more pragmatic than Xiuquan. He understood that everything could not be reduced to religious fanaticism. One could not destroy all Confucian heritage. Educated Chinese would never accept such power. Compromises and flexibility were needed, but Xiuquan was unyielding in his religious convictions. This created tension between the two leaders. By the mid-50s, the contradictions reached a critical point. In August of the 56th year, troops commanded by Yang Shuqing inflicted a crushing defeat on the Qing army near Nanjing. It was a brilliant victory, and the mood in the capital was buoyant. Solemn celebrations were organized. And it was at these celebrations that Yang Shuqing made a fatal mistake. He demanded that Xiuquan publicly hold a prayer service in his, Yang Shuqing's, honor. Moreover, he declared that he wanted to change his title from 9,000 years to 10,000 years. In the Chinese imperial tradition, the title 10,000 years was borne only by the emperor. This was a challenge, almost a usurpation of power. Xiuquan outwardly agreed, even holding the prayer service, but inside, everything was seething. He understood. If he did not stop Yang Shuqing now, the latter would soon simply remove him from power or eliminate him altogether. He had to act first. Secretly, through trusted people, Xiuquan contacted another king, Wei Changhui, the North King. He commanded troops outside Nanjing. Wei Changhui had also long envied Yang Shuqing's power and gladly agreed to participate in the conspiracy. On the 2nd of September, the 56th year, deep in the night, Wei Changhui's troops burst into Nanjing through a secret gate. The massacre began. Soldiers surrounded Yang Shuqing's palace. Wei Changhui himself personally broke into the chambers of the East King and killed him. Along with him, his brothers, his entire family, and his associates were killed. Initially, the plan was only to eliminate Yang Shuqing himself and his closest relatives. But, as often happens, the cycle of violence spun out of control. Wei Changhui unleashed a real terror. He began to seek out everyone who had ever served under Yang Shuqing, who was loyal to him, who might seek revenge for his death. Over several months, from September to November of the 56th year, between 20,000 and 30,000 people were killed. 30,000! These were not just soldiers. This was the backbone of the Taiping army and administration. The best officers, experienced officials, hardened fighters. They were killed right on the streets of Nanjing, and their bodies were thrown into the Yangtze River. The city turned into a place of nightmare. Xiuquan, the Wing King, the youngest and most talented of the kings, was on a military campaign at the time. When news of the massacre reached him, he immediately moved toward the capital. But it was too late. His family, wife, and children had already been killed on Wei Changhui's orders. Xiuquan was furious. He wrote to Xiuquan, "If you do not stop this madman, the Taiping state will perish, not at the hands of its enemies, but from internal strife." Xiuquan realized he had gone too far. Wei Changhui had become uncontrollable and now posed a threat to the Heavenly King himself. Hong gave the order to capture and execute Wei Changhui. After 2 days of street fighting in Nanjing, Wei Changhui was captured and beheaded along with his closest associate, Qin Rigang. At the end of November of the 56th year, Xiuquan arrived in Nanjing. Xiuquan placed him at the head of the government and the army, hoping that the young, energetic commander could stabilize the situation. And Xiuquan did stop the collapse for a time. He strengthened the capital's defenses, organized a counteroffensive against Qing troops, and halted their advance through the Yangtze Valley. But Xiuquan became afraid again. He saw how popular Xiuquan was among the soldiers and the people, how respected he was by other commanders. The paranoia that had already ruined Yang Shuqing now turned against Xiuquan. Xiuquan began to sideline him from real power. Instead, he transferred governance to his relatives, brothers and favorites from Guangdong province. These people had neither the experience nor the talent of Xiuquan, but they were personally loyal to Hong. Xiuquan understood, if he stayed in Nanjing, the same fate awaited him as Yang Shuqing. In June of the 57th year, fearing for his life, he secretly left the capital. His army left with him, more than 100,000 of the best warriors. He led his troops first to Anhui province, then to Jiangxi, then further west. From this moment on, Xiuquan's army operated independently, having effectively broken with Xiuquan's state. This was a catastrophe. In 1 year, from September of the 56th year to June of the 57th year, the Taiping Kingdom lost more than in all previous military campaigns combined. 30,000 hardened fighters and administrators died. 3 of the 5 kings were killed. Yang Shuqing, Wei Changhui, Xiao Chaogui had died earlier in battle. Feng Yunshan, the South King, also fell in battle. Only Xiuquan remained, but he too had left with his army. The Qing Dynasty immediately took advantage of this split. Already at the end of the 56th year, Qing troops went on the offensive along almost the entire front. On the 19th of December, they finally captured Wuhan, a crucial strategic point. Other cities and regions also began to fall one by one. The Taipings were forced to switch to defense. And what about the ideals? Where did the beautiful principles of equality and brotherhood, for which everything began, go? It turned out that utopia in practice turns into a rigid hierarchy, no better than the one under the Qing Dynasty. Xiuquan, who preached simplicity and the renunciation of luxury, lived in a palace with a harem. The king princes, who spoke of communal property, built themselves mansions and accumulated wealth. The cult of personality surrounding Xiuquan reached absurd proportions. He was called the Heavenly King, the True Lord, the Anointed of the Lord. One had to prostrate oneself before him, calling oneself an unworthy servant. Addressing him directly was forbidden, only through special intermediaries. This was the typical Confucian hierarchy that the Taiping supposedly rejected. Moreover, Xiuquan announced that power in the Heavenly Kingdom would be inherited. His elder son, a teenager, received the title of the Junior Lord and was considered the heir to the throne. Where was the equality? Where was the Christian principle that all are equal before God? It turned out that some were more equal than others. Problems also began in the army. After the departure of the best commanders, discipline weakened. Troops that were previously severely punished for looting now plundered the local population. Peasants who initially greeted the Taipings as liberators began to turn away from them. the governance of the captured territories became increasingly chaotic. The land reform was never truly implemented. Communal treasuries existed only in proclamations. Of course, there were still people devoted to the cause. New commanders, Li Xiuquan and Chen Yucheng, proved to be talented military leaders. They managed to stabilize the front for a time, won several important victories, and even lifted the blockade of Nanjing in the 60th year. But this was a struggle for survival, not for victory. The initiative had already passed to the enemy. The tragedy of the Taiping Kingdom is that it perished not so much from external enemies as from its own contradictions, from the fact that the leaders could not rise above personal ambitions, from the fact that beautiful ideals were shattered by the reality of power, from the fact that Xiuquan, sincerely believing in his divine mission, proved incapable of practical state management. The events of the 56th and 57th years became the turning point. After them, the Taiping Kingdom continued to exist for 7 more years, but essentially, it was an agony. A slow, agonizing death under the blows of external enemies and internal strife. The spark that had once flared up in the mountains of Guangxi gradually extinguished, leaving behind only ashes and blood. Paradoxically, the Qing Dynasty was losing in the initial phase of the rebellion, not because it was fundamentally weak. The empire remained vast, with a multi-million population and colossal resources. The problem was that its army had turned into an empty shell, a theater of the absurd, where everyone pretended to be ready to defend the empire, but in reality thought only of their own pockets. Imagine, the regular Qing Dynasty army officially numbered almost 1 million soldiers. An impressive figure, right? But in reality, they were hungry, poorly armed, demoralized people who had not been paid for months. Officers stole the money intended for the soldiers. Generals entered dead souls into the lists to collect their pay. The weapons were outdated, muskets that were half a century old, swords, and spears against the fanatical Taipings. Training? What training? Many soldiers had received no training at all. They were simply recruited from villages, given weapons, and sent into battle. It is not surprising that they fled at the first serious clash with the Taipings. And many soldiers themselves smoked opium, the very poison that was internally corroding the empire. With such an army, it was impossible to defeat even poorly armed rebels, let alone the disciplined and motivated Taiping army. But the Qing Dynasty had one important advantage. It could learn from its mistakes. And the main lesson learned from the first defeats was, the central imperial army is useless. Something else is needed. And that something else appeared in the form of regional militias, Yongying as they were called. Private armies created by local officials and wealthy landowners with their own money and under their own command. The first to create such an army was Zheng Guofan, an official from Hunan province, a Confucian scholar, a man of strict principles. In the 52nd year, he began forming the Xiang army, named after the Xiang River that flows through his native province. Zheng recruited soldiers personally, carefully selecting each one. He took peasants from his native areas, reliable people, with families, with reputation. Not vagrants and déclassé elements, but those who had something to lose. The main difference between these new armies and the old imperial ones was personal loyalty. The soldier served not an abstract emperor somewhere in distant Beijing. He served his commander, a fellow countryman, a man he knew personally, who paid him on time, who cared for his family. Officers did not constantly change, as in the regular army. They formed almost familial relationships with their subordinates. This created incredible combat effectiveness. Zheng Guofan's Xiang army proved itself in battles. It slowly, methodically recaptured city after city from the Taipings. Zheng did not rush or take unnecessary risks. He besieged cities for months, cut off supplies, and starved the enemy. His strategy resembled a boa constrictor slowly tightening its coils around its prey. But Zheng Guofan was no longer young, and he needed assistance. One of his students became Li Hongzhang, a young, energetic official from Anhui province. In the year 1861, Zheng Guofan instructed him to create his own army to defend Li's native province against the Taipings. Li Hongzhang turned out to be a brilliant organizer. He formed the Huai Army, named after the Huai River, with a strength of about 25,000 people. He recruited them from local residents of Anhui, and even added some Taiping prisoners who agreed to switch sides to the dynasty. 3 months were spent on training, discipline, drill, and shooting. And most importantly, Li Hongzhang actively purchased modern Western weapons, rifles, artillery, even steamships for operations on the rivers. In the spring of the 62nd year, the Huai army fought its first battle, the Battle for Shanghai. This city was a key point, the largest trading port where thousands of foreigners lived, English, French, Americans. All international trade flowed through Shanghai, and the Taipings decided to capture it. The Qing Dynasty faced a choice. It could not defend Shanghai alone. Aid from Western powers was needed, and they hesitated for a long time. On the one hand, the Taipings were somewhat Christian, albeit very strange. Many European missionaries initially sympathized with them. On the other hand, the Taipings smashed foreign trading posts, interfered with business, and were unpredictable. And the Qing Dynasty had already proven itself a reliable partner. After the Opium Wars, it fulfilled all treaties, opened ports, and paid indemnities. Ultimately, the Europeans chose the Qing side. The English and French decided that a stable, albeit weak, Qing Empire was better for trade than the incomprehensible religious state of the Taipings. In the 62nd year, the ever-victorious army was created under the command of European officers, first the American Frederick Ward, then the Englishman Charles Gordon. These were several thousand Chinese soldiers, trained to European standards and armed with modern rifles and cannons. The sieges of Shanghai in the 61st and 62nd years became a turning point. The Taipings approached the city walls twice, assaulting them twice. But each time they were repelled by the combined forces of the Huai army, Western mercenaries, and foreign troops. Modern weapons and professional command prevailed over numbers and fanaticism. After this, the initiative definitively passed to the Qing Dynasty. Zheng Guofan's Shang army slowly but steadily tightened the blockade around Nanjing from the west. Li Hongzhang's Huai army attacked from the east. The ever-victorious army cleared territories in the lower Yangtze. In addition, other regional armies appeared, tens of thousands of fighters under the command of local warlords. The Taipings tried to counterattack. Their young, talented generals Li Xiuquan and Chen Yucheng won isolated victories and broke through the blockade. In the 60th year, they even lifted the siege of Nanjing, defeating part of the Qing troops. But these were no longer offensive operations, but a desperate struggle for survival. The territory under Taiping control slowly but surely shrank. City after city fell into the hands of the Qing Dynasty. Supplying Nanjing became increasingly difficult. Qing troops cut off the supply routes for provisions. Starvation began. And in June of the 63rd year, the Qing Dynasty inflicted another terrible blow on the Taipings. They crushed the army of Xiuquan. Remember that young, talented wing king who left Nanjing with his troops in the 57th year? He operated independently for 7 years, fighting in the western provinces, trying to create an independent base there. With 100,000 fighters, he passed through Hunan, Guizhou, and Yunnan provinces, reaching as far as Xiuquan. But everywhere he was met by Qing troops. Local residents, tired of the war, did not support him. The army melted away from disease, desertion, and battles. By the 63rd year, he had less than half left. In May or June of the 63rd year, Xiuquan's army was trapped in Sichuan province at the Dadu River. Crossing proved impossible. A flood began, and the river overflowed its banks. Qing troops surrounded the Taiping camp. A siege began. Provisions ran out. Soldiers died of starvation. Xiuquan realized that further resistance was pointless. He surrendered, hoping that his soldiers would be spared. But the Qing Dynasty was ruthless. Thousands of Taiping prisoners were executed. Xiuquan himself was subjected to a terrible execution, lingqi, the death by 1,000 cuts. This was a traditional Chinese execution for traitors and rebels. Parts of the body were slowly cut off, piece by piece, prolonging the agony for hours or even days. The young, talented commander, who could have been the savior of the Taipings, was only 32 years old. With the death of Xiuquan and his army, the Taipings lost their last chance for victory. Nanjing was completely isolated. The ring of several armies tightened around the capital of the Heavenly Kingdom. The Shang army from the west, the Hui army from the east, other regional militias from the north and south. More than 100,000 Qing Dynasty soldiers, well-armed, trained, and motivated, many of them fighting for their native lands against the Taiping outsiders. The Qing Dynasty learned to fight. It no longer relied on the corrupt regular army. It created a new type of armed force, regional militias, based on personal loyalty and modern weapons. This was a revolution in military affairs that allowed the empire to survive. However, this same system would later, a few decades later, lead to the fragmentation of China as regional warlords turned into independent military dictators. But that would be later in the 20th century. For now, in the 63rd and 64th years, the Qing Dynasty was triumphant. The end of the Heavenly Kingdom was near. All that remained was to take Nanjing and end this rebellion once and for all. And then they could count the price, the terrible, unbelievable price of this war, which claimed tens of millions of lives. There is a moment in every war when it becomes clear the end is near. Not because some decisive battle took place or the last fortress fell. It is simply that people can no longer fight. They have no strength, no food, no hope. And precisely such a moment arrived for the Taiping Kingdom in the second half of the 63rd year. The ring of the blockade tightened like a noose around the neck of the condemned. Imagine, several armies surrounded Nanjing. The Xiang, the Hui, other regional militias, more than 100,000 soldiers. They cut off all roads, all supply routes for provisions. The Yangtze, the great river that always fed the cities on its banks, now turned into a border between life and death. Qing troops controlled it, preventing grain, rice, and vegetables from being brought into the besieged capital. And yet, hundreds of thousands of people were in and around Nanjing. Soldiers, officials, artisans, ordinary townspeople, refugees from ruined villages. All of them had to eat something, but there was nothing to eat. The territory of the Taiping Kingdom turned into a gigantic theater of military operations. Cities were destroyed, workshops and manufactories stood idle, and trade froze. And the worst thing, the fields were empty. You see, the peasants were mobilized into the army. Men who should have been plowing the land, sowing grain, and harvesting crops were instead standing on the walls with spears in their hands or marching in column formations. The fields became overgrown with shrubs. The irrigation systems, which had been maintained for centuries, fell into disrepair. Dams broke. No one repaired them. Weirs deteriorated. And in China, rice fields require constant care, meticulous irrigation. Without it, starvation. And starvation came, first in the villages of the territories controlled by the Taipings, then in small towns. Then it reached Nanjing itself. By the end of the 63rd year, people in the capital of the Heavenly Kingdom began to eat grass. Tree bark, leather belts, and shoes were boiled in water, attempting to extract some nutritional substances. People died right on the streets. But hunger was not the only killer. With it came disease. Cholera, a terrible epidemic that spreads through contaminated water. And in a besieged city, where sanitation collapsed, where sewage entered drinking water sources, where people's immunity was weakened by hunger, cholera mowed down thousands. There were also typhus, dysentery, and other infections. Some Taiping armies operating in the provinces lost up to half their personnel to disease. Half. Not in battle, to disease. Most armies lost from 20% to 25% of their fighters. It was a real hell. Soldiers lay in fever, vomiting and tormented by diarrhea, weakening with each day and finally dying. There was no one and nowhere to bury them. Bodies were simply thrown into the river or left in ditches. This further contaminated the water, intensifying the epidemics. Peasants who initially supported the Taipings as liberators now fled the combat zone. Tired of war, requisitions, hunger, and violence, they simply wanted to survive. Many areas changed hands several times. First, the Taipings came, crushed the rich, distributed land. Then Qing troops came, massacred Taiping supporters, and seized the grain. Then the Taipings again. The village was completely ruined. By the beginning of the 64th year, the Taipings were pushed back within 50 miles of Nanjing. That was it. Nothing remained of the vast state that once controlled territories with 30 million inhabitants. Only the capital and a few nearby towns, surrounded on all sides by enemies. On the 20th of December, the 63rd year, General Li Xiuquan, one of the last talented Taiping commanders, returned to Nanjing from a campaign. He saw the real state of affairs. He understood. The city was doomed. And he came to Xiuquan and pleaded with him, leave the city. While there is still a chance to break through the blockade, lead at least part of the troops, retreat into the mountains, continue the struggle from there. Do not let the Qing Dynasty destroy everything at once. But Xiuquan refused. He locked himself in his palace, surrounded by concubines and flatterers, immersed in religious visions. He still believed that the Heavenly Father would not let him perish, that a miracle would happen and the enemies would be defeated by celestial forces. He announced that anyone who disobeyed his order to hold out until the end would be immediately executed. He took overall command of the defense, he, who was not a military man, who had not left the palace for years. In February or March of the 64th year, the last forts around Nanjing fell. On the 28th of February, Tianbao Castle on the top of Purple Mountain was captured. On the 2nd of March, Shengshe fell. The blockade was completely finalized. Nanjing turned into a trap. And on the 1st of June, the 64th year, an event occurred that finally broke the spirit of the defenders. Xiuquan died. The Heavenly King, the younger brother of Jesus, the prophet and founder of the Heavenly Kingdom, was dead. It was officially announced that he died from food poisoning. It is said he ate wild plants, manna, grass that was boiled to combat hunger, and it turned out to be poisonous. But many historians believe otherwise. Most likely, it was suicide. Xiuquan understood that everything had collapsed, that the Heavenly Kingdom was doomed, that God had not sent a miracle, and he deliberately poisoned himself, unable to bear the collapse of all his dreams. The prophet who promised an eternal kingdom of justice on earth died in a besieged city, surrounded by starving corpses. Power passed to his son, Hong Tianguifu, a teenager of 15 years old, the junior lord, as he was called, a boy who did not understand war, who could not command armies, who was merely a symbol, an empty figure in the hands of generals. But there were almost no generals left. Shi Dekai executed a year ago. Yang Xiuqing, Wei Changhui, Feng Yunshan, Xiao Chaogui, all dead. Only Li Xiucheng and Chen Yucheng remained, desperately trying to maintain the defense. On the 19th of July at 1 o'clock in the morning, Qing sappers detonated a mine beneath the Taiping Gate. A huge explosion echoed over the sleeping city. The gate collapsed, killing several hundred people. Along with the gate, a large part of the city wall collapsed. A breach formed, and Qing troops poured through it. street fighting began. 3 days, from the 19th to the 22nd of July, a brutal, bloody struggle continued for every street, every alley, every house. The Taipings fought desperately. They knew there would be no mercy. Better to die with a weapon in hand than to surrender to the enemies. Qing troops attacked in 4 directions, tightening the ring toward the city center. Artillery fired directly at the barricades. But then they had to stop. The risk of killing their own soldiers in hand-to-hand combat was too great. By the evening of the first day, all the city gates were in the hands of Qing troops. 1,000 of Li Xiuquan's fighters attempted a breakthrough at night. They disguised themselves as Qing soldiers, approached the Taiping Gate, and successfully slipped through a section of the ruined wall. Qing soldiers were busy looting and did not stop them. Li Xiuquan was trying to save at least the young Hong Tianguifu, the last representative of the Heavenly Qing Dynasty. And the massacre continued in the city. More than 100,000 people died in 3 days. 100,000 in 3 days. This was not war, it was extermination. Qing soldiers, embittered by years of heavy fighting, by the loss of comrades, spared no one. Men were killed on the spot, women were raped and then killed. Even children were not spared. The Manchus remembered how the Taipings had massacred the Manchu garrison when they captured the city 11 years earlier. Now it was time for revenge. After the mass looting, the city was set on fire. First, the soldiers set fire to the Taiping palaces, the luxurious buildings where the king princes lived. Then they set fire to ordinary houses. The fire spread rapidly. Nanjing burned. The fire continued until the 26th of July. The ancient capital was engulfed in flames for a whole week. When everything was over, Zheng Guofan, the commander of the Xiang army, the man who did the most to suppress the rebellion, ordered the body of Hong Xiuquan to be found. They found him in the palace garden, where he had been secretly buried after his death. The body was exhumed. Then it was decapitated, posthumously, for symbolic punishment. The head was displayed for public view, the body was cremated, and the ashes were loaded into a cannon and fired, scattered to the wind, so that even the remains would not rest in the earth. This was a traditional execution for traitors, eternal punishment, denial of burial, a curse on the soul forever and ever. Nanjing fell. The heavenly capital turned into ruins and ashes. The Taiping kingdom ceased to exist. However, isolated groups of Taipings continued to fight for several more years. One group retreated to the border of Fujian and Guangdong provinces and resisted until January of the 66th year. Another merged with the Nian rebels in the north and continued the struggle until August of the 68th year. But these were already the last convulsions of a dying movement. Li Xiuquan was captured and executed. The young Hong Tianguifu was also caught and beheaded. He was only 16 years old. The Qing Dynasty methodically hunted down and destroyed everyone associated with the Taiping kingdom. Thousands of executions swept through the liberated territories. The war ended. This rebellion lasted 14 years, from December of the 50th year to August of the 64th year. 14 years of hell, blood, famine, and death. And now it was time to count the price. The terrible, unimaginable price of this attempt to build the heavenly kingdom on earth. When a war ends, it is time to count. To count the destroyed cities, the burned villages, the deserted fields. But the worst thing is to count the people who are no longer there. And here begin the numbers that take one's breath away, numbers so monstrous that the mind refuses to comprehend them. According to the most conservative estimates, the Taiping Rebellion claimed between 20 million and 30 million lives. 20 million. Try to grasp this figure. That is more than the entire population of modern Australia. It is as if all the residents of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and a dozen other major cities combined vanished. Some researchers cite even more terrible figures. If one considers not only the direct losses from the rebellion, but also the associated conflicts, the Nian Rebellion in the north, revolts in other provinces, the Second Opium War with Western powers, and the natural disasters that the weakened state could not cope with, the total number of dead could reach 100 million people. 100 million. This would be the most terrible catastrophe in the history of humankind. However, it must be noted here, accurate data does not exist and cannot exist. In the mid-19th century, there was no reliable census in China. Officials kept records of the number of taxpayers, but these records were incomplete and inaccurate. Many families hid from census takers to avoid paying taxes. Regions engulfed in war provided no data at all. The Qing Dynasty may have deliberately inflated the casualty figures to show the scale of the danger it overcame, to justify the brutality of the suppression. Modern Chinese sources are also sometimes prone to exaggeration. The rebellion has become part of the national mythology, a symbol of popular resistance. But even if the largest figures are discarded and the minimum estimates are taken, the result is between 20 million and 30 million dead. This is from 5% to 10% of the entire population of China at that time. For comparison, the First World War, that very great slaughter that shocked the whole world in the beginning of the 20th century, claimed 17 million lives. And the Taiping Rebellion, about which few people outside China know today, killed more. It was one of the bloodiest events in human history and the largest armed conflict of the 19th century. And what is especially terrifying, most of these people died not in battle. Not from bullets and swords, not by storming city walls or defending their homes from enemies. They died of hunger, from disease, from epidemics and exhaustion. The war turned fertile valleys into a desert. 17 provinces of China, practically the entire central and southern region of the country, were devastated. Cities lay in ruins. Villages were burned. Fields were overgrown with weeds. Roads and bridges were destroyed. Irrigation systems, which had been created for centuries, fell into disrepair. Dams on rivers broke. There was no one to repair them. The lower Yangtze region, the wealthiest and most fertile in China, suffered particularly. The places where commerce and craftsmanship had flourished for centuries, where rice fields fed millions, turned into a zone of death. The cities of Nanjing, Suzhou, Hangzhou, the jewels of Chinese civilization, were looted, burned, and depopulated. The population of some areas was reduced by 2/3 or even 3/4. The economy collapsed. Trade froze. Artisan workshops stood empty. The craftsmen had died or fled. Silk production, porcelain manufactories, tea plantations, everything declined. China, which was one of the wealthiest countries in the world in the beginning of the 19th century, turned into an impoverished, devastated country. And this is despite the fact that the war lasted only 14 years. 14 years out of the millennia-long history of China. But those 14 years were enough to set the country back by decades. Recovery took generations. Some regions returned to their pre-war population levels only by the beginning of the 20th century, 40 years after the rebellion ended. Demographers studied Chinese cycles of population growth and decline. There were periods of catastrophic wars and famines in China's history before, when the population sharply decreased. But the Taiping Rebellion became one of the most terrible failures on the demographic curve. After it, a long, agonizing phase of recovery began. And yet, this nightmare could have been avoided. If the Qing Dynasty had not been so corrupt, if officials had not squeezed the last juices out of the peasants, if the emperor had listened to the protests against the opium trade, if Xiuquan and his associates had not started a power struggle among themselves, had not drowned in intrigue and suspicion, if the Western powers had not intervened on the side of the Qing Dynasty. But history does not tolerate the subjunctive mood. Everything happened as it happened. 20 million people, peasants and soldiers, women and children, the elderly and infants, died in this war. Their names were not remembered by anyone. Their graves have long been overgrown with grass. But the memory of them lives on in the deserted villages, in the abandoned fields, in the destroyed cities. It lives on in the terrible price China paid for the attempt to build the heavenly kingdom on earth. When the cannons fall silent and the smoke of battle clears, it seems the war is over. But in reality, it continues to live, in the memory of the people, in the changed political system, in the lessons learned by the victors and the vanquished. And the Taiping Rebellion, despite its defeat, left a mark so deep that it is still felt in China today. The Qing Dynasty won. But it was a Pyrrhic victory, one where the winner is almost indistinguishable from the defeated. The empire survived, but emerged from the war completely changed. The central authority, which had kept the vast country in submission for centuries, was so weakened that it could never recover. Remember those regional militias created by Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang, and other commanders? The Xiang army, the Huai army, and dozens of others. They were the ones who saved the dynasty. But these armies were loyal not to the emperor in distant Beijing, but to their commanders. After the end of the rebellion, they were not disbanded. It was too dangerous to leave the country unprotected. After all, the Taipings were defeated, but other threats remained. The Nian Rebellion in the north, Muslim revolts in the west, and European powers demanding ever new concessions. And these regional commanders turned into virtually independent rulers in their provinces. They had their own armies, their own treasuries, their own administrations. They collected taxes, appointed officials, and conducted foreign trade. The emperor could ask them, but not command. Central authority disintegrated before their eyes. This weakening of China was immediately felt by its neighbors. The Russian Empire, which had long eyed the rich lands of Primorye, took advantage of the moment. In the year 1860, when the Taiping Rebellion was still ongoing and the Qing Dynasty was preoccupied with fighting for survival, Russia annexed the Primorsky Krai. The Treaty of Beijing secured these lands for Russia. China was too weak to protest. But the most important legacy of the rebellion was not political, but in the consciousness of the people. Millions of Chinese went through the crucible of war. They saw that the Qing dynasty could be defeated, that Manchu troops were not invincible, that the Europeans who helped the Qing suppress the rebellion were not friends of China, but colonizers protecting their own interests. Anti-Western sentiment grew. The Chinese saw the English and French shelling their countrymen near Shanghai. How European officers commanded the ever-victorious army that massacred entire cities. How foreign powers dictated terms to the weakened empire. All this prepared the ground for future anti-colonial movements, the Boxer Rebellion at the end of the 19th century, and the revolutionary movements of the beginning of the 20th. And in the 20th century, when the communists came to power in China, they declared the Taiping Rebellion their predecessor. Mao Zedong called it the greatest wave of peasant wars in history. For the communists, the Taipings were heroes, peasants who rose up against feudal lords and foreign invaders, fighting for equality and justice. Of course, this was an idealization. Mao kept silent about Xiuquan's religious fanaticism, the massacres and repressions, the contradictions between utopian ideals and actual practice. He needed a beautiful legend of a popular uprising, not the complex, contradictory reality. But this legend worked. It inspired millions of Chinese to fight for a new China. Interestingly, the modern Chinese government uses the history of the Taipings in a completely different way. For the Communist Party of China of the 21st century, the Taiping Rebellion is a warning about how dangerous religious sects are, how they can raise the people against the state, and how much blood they can shed. This is why there are such rigid restrictions on religious activity in modern China. This is why the authorities so severely suppress movements like Falun Gong. They see in them potential new Taipings who could split the country. History has become a justification for authoritarianism. But what exactly was the Taiping Rebellion? Scholars have been arguing about this for a century and a half. Was it a social movement of peasants for equality, or a nationalist rebellion of the Han against the foreign Manchu dynasty, an attempt to modernize China along Western lines, or simply religious fanaticism that led to catastrophe? It was probably all of the above. Xiuquan sincerely believed in his divine mission. The peasants who followed him truly sought a better life, justice, and land. The ideas of equality between men and women, the abolition of private property, and the fight against opium were progressive for their time. But all of this was corrupted by power, ambition, and religious extremism. The Taipings tried to destroy the old world of Confucian hierarchy and Manchu domination. But instead of a new world of equality and brotherhood, they built a theocratic despotism, where Xiuquan ruled as an absolute monarch, where the king princes slaughtered each other in the struggle for power, where utopian ideals remained on paper, and the reality was as cruel as under the Qing Dynasty. And yet one cannot deny that it was a grandiose attempt, an attempt to create a state based on new principles, an attempt that was ahead of its time in some aspects, especially regarding women's rights, an attempt that showed that the people can rise up, can fight, and can create an alternative to the existing power. The Taiping Rebellion remains in world history as the most massive sect state the world has ever seen. Neither before nor after has there been a case where a religious movement controlled territory with 30 million people, created a regular army of hundreds of thousands of fighters, and existed for more than 10 years. This was the largest civil conflict of the 19th century. In terms of casualties, it surpassed all European wars of that time combined. It changed China irreversibly. It undermined the Qing Dynasty, which lasted for another half a century afterward, but only as a shadow of its former self. It prepared the Chinese for the future revolutions and upheavals of the 20th century. When one looks today at modern China, a powerful state, the second largest economy in the world, a country with 1.5 billion people, it is difficult to imagine that a century and a half ago it was on the verge of collapse, that 14 years of civil war almost tore it apart, that 20 million people died in an attempt to build the heavenly kingdom on earth. The history of the Taiping Rebellion is a story about how the best intentions can lead to catastrophe, about how utopian dreams shatter against reality, about how power corrupts even the most sincere idealists. But it is also a story about the bravery of millions of ordinary people who believed that the world could be better and were willing to fight for it, even though they lost, even though their kingdom collapsed. But the attempt itself remained in memory. It inspired future generations of Chinese to fight for justice, to strive for change. And in that sense, the Taipings did not disappear in the year 1864. They live in everyone who dreams of a better world and is ready to fight for it.